Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Shalom, good evening. Goeienaand, good people. Welcome to Liberty and Friends, the 7th episode of Liberty and Friends. We have had a hiatus, a period when we did not see each other, as I was, I was away. I was on the road and I was away commemorating Pesach most of last week, so I didn't have a show. I hope you guys missed me. It's good to be back, and it's good to be on your screens again. This is Liberty and Friends, your Sunday evening news wrap-up show here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. This is the show, of course, that I'm hoping will ever increasingly become your definitive week-ending show. We provide news, analysis, and opinion, of course, from what will be a panel of guests on the show. If you're just joining us, welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. I know we've been away for quite a while. Please smash that like button and, of course, share this link so that we can build the audience over time. Welcome to it. The show has a very special, a couple of special guests tonight. Two individuals who really, for me, are some of the sharpest and smartest, really, minds in South Africa when it comes to political analysis and really analysis across the board of the state of things in the country. Before I introduce them, a reminder, please, that you can support the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That information is in the descriptor of this video. Please, 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 one of the best ways you can support is just hit that like button and share this link. Welcome to it, Liberty and Friends. Without further ado, let me bring my guests on to the show. Tonight, the Institute of Race Relations is in the house. And with that being said, let me actually just bring them into frame now. First, I will bring Terence Corrigan, who, of course, is... Terence, what are you doing actually at the IRR? I've forgotten. Well, what do you do there?
I write. I write, I analyze, I communicate, mostly about property rights, but then I do have a few sidelines, as I suppose we all do. Written about ideology, political culture, a little bit about religion, free speech, the importance of non-racism. But property rights, let's say, is the firstborn.
Absolutely. Terence, good to have you on tonight's show, Liberty and Friends. That's Terence Corrigan, of course, from the Institute of Race Relations. And, of course, last but not least is Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Dr. Jeffery, or rather Anthea, good evening. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. Hello to you and all your viewers.
Fantastic. Very good to have you on the show. As is custom on Liberty and Friends, we often begin the show by looking at the news week that was. This is the show that often wraps up the news week, but tonight's show will have a major focus because I want to refresh the minds and help those who maybe haven't caught up yet to keep up with the threats that we're facing to our property rights. I know there's been a lot of movement in our institutions, namely Parliament and, of course, in government. So we'll get to that. That'll be the main segment of the show in about 20 minutes or so. But before we do, we often chat on the show on, some of the things that made headlines and got South Africans talking. And, there's only really 3 or 4 things that I want to chat about. And the first one for me, because it registered on a personal level, I suppose, given my faith, was the comments made by one Dr. Lwazi Lushaba, who is an academic at the University of Cape Town. The big headline this week, just in case you didn't see it, dear viewer, was that the University of Cape Town would be launching an investigation into the conduct of Dr. Lushaba after he made anti-Semitic remarks. The remarks themselves being verbatim that Hitler committed no crime. He said these or made these comments in the context of making an argument that, as he put it, because in relation to what he argued is how we view political science as a as a school, excuse me, was that, well, because historically, none of these scholars of political science had ever recognized the murder or killing or genocide of whites, as he put it, on black people. Well, he makes the argument that they only began to care about genocide, or the founders of the school of political thought or science, excuse me, only really began to care when whites, as he put it, started killing whites, in reference to Nazi Germany killing Jews. And he therefore argues that, well, in real terms, Hitler committed no crime. And if he did commit a crime, as he put it, and again, these are verbatim in this case, if they did commit a crime, well, they only recognized it because it was now whites killing whites. Your thoughts, Terence, on a comment like that?
Well, look, I think at a very basic level, it's in very poor taste. I can understand how offensive this must be to Jewish people, for whom this is something that was only like 1 or 2 generations back. I mean, there are still people who lived through the Holocaust. I suppose one could make an argument that in a university setting we have all sorts of funny ideas, and maybe this could be a prompt for a discussion, a very provocative one. Question is this being put forward as the starting point for a discussion, or a sort of statement of almost cultish race grifting belief?
Yeah.
Now the doctor has a particular reputation, so I'm not quite sure that this was about I'm putting a provocative idea. Let's argue it. Now, I think also I think that there are perhaps grains of truth in what he's saying. The Holocaust was a particular instance which I think more than anything made racism unfashionable. It brought a lot of pre-existing race beliefs, eugenics, all that sort of thing, and it took them to this obscene conclusion. Anti-Semitism had existed since the Roman Empire. It had existed in predominantly Christian and predominantly Muslim societies. What the Nazis did was sort of added the scientific bunkum on top of that, and in a sense almost washed out the religious justification, and had these ideas about racial hygiene. Now after that, it was in the 1940s that you had South Africa's internal policies. What became apartheid becoming controversial elsewhere. So, but I think what the Holocaust embodied was it was this idea that you had this very cultured, very advanced, very educated people that did this sort of thing, in an industrial fashion. It wasn't, bands of guys going around shooting people. This was like, lining them up and and essentially putting them in death factories. That sort of thing was quite novel. Now, you can talk about previous genocides, the Armenians in the 1920s, the Herero in Namibia. Go back to the Mongols. A Genghis Khan decided he wanted trade routes to go in different directions. So he literally erased cities. When the description of the Mongol sack of Samarkand, where they took molten silver and poured it down the throat of the governor, these sort of things are not unique in history. I do think, though, that over the last sort of 200 years, we have thankfully become more aware that it is morally wrong. If racist beliefs, would overlook it in the case of people of a different race, that is to the eternal shame of those who did so. But to say, well, we only care about that because this is something that whites did to other whites. I don't think that actually stands up fully to scrutiny. And I think that argument, as well as being offensive, is deeply problematic.
Again, for me, it was the cheapening of, firstly, the fudging of history, but also the cheapening of human life, period. This idea, and this happens often from people who don't intrinsically argue from a position of respecting life, liberty, and property. That, there can be a selective morality often applied and often viewed through a lens of, aesthetic things, whether it's race or gender, or all of these things that have become the hallmark now, unfortunately, of university campuses across the world, and really hasn't spared South African university campuses. And I want to bring in Anthea here just on a slightly different angle, but linked to this. And I made the point in my vlog in response to Leshaba's comments, is that part of what would make someone say something like this is the ideology that has now infiltrated our campuses of critical race theory, of this notion of, I like to call it hate, beating hate through hate, as is often, encapsulated in the anti-racist approach, for example, of a one Ibrahim X. Kendi. I know you've written a little bit, and you sort of started doing the work of looking into critical race theory, but just at an overview level, your thoughts on this and how this is now being pushed onto our kids, effectively, if you have kids in the university.
Well, I think the one aspect of CRT that really comes to light with this comment is its refusal to take account of objective truth, its attempt to rewrite a whole number of things which have happened in the past, and to deny them and to put a different spin on other events. And it's extraordinary to suggest that Hitler didn't commit a crime. That part for everything that came out of the Nuremberg Tribunal about the seeding of a global war, apart from what was done in the Holocaust, and which Stalin also, of course, participated in. Ironically, he was part of the Nuremberg Tribunal, even though the Soviet Union had also helped to seed that global conflict, and had also, certainly before the war began, murdered millions of people in the Ukraine and elsewhere as part of the collectivization of the farms. And it seems to me that what CRT is trying to do is to have an extremely selective view on what parts of history it's willing to look at. And it's also undoubtedly willing to try and rewrite the historical record. And then when people object for good reason, because clearly this is historically inaccurate, to go on to the kind of assault, to insult people very often for trying to stick to the historical truth. And it just takes us so much further away from our capacity to look at the evidence, to come to evidence-based solutions for the many problems that we face. And I think that's an extraordinarily sad thing, that we're in that situation. And it also makes me think about the Truth Commission, because I wrote a book on the Truth Commission soon after it came out. And at that point, we thought it rather extraordinary that the Truth Commission suggested that there were 4 different types of truth, and that factual or objective truth was only one of them, and that you could have various other kinds of truth which depend essentially on sort of narrative and lived experience and the hurt of wounded memories. But that, again, is making for a very selective set of memories that are considered worthy of respect. So in this particular instance, there are any number of wounded memories in the Jewish community, as there are in so many other places around the world when dreadful massacres and genocides have taken place. And we need to recognize them all, not try and filter some of them out.
Absolutely. And again, I know what's going to happen, just to conclude this segment, because I know it's likely going to be a bit of a developing story, because UCT only came out last week to say that, look, they're going to look into the comments and investigate. But I know what's going to happen here, or at least let me say I can preempt what's going to happen. Leshaba is likely going to try and walk these comments back, especially given the furor, rightly, by the way, from the Jewish community in this country, and not just the Jewish community, but anybody who heard these comments and who saw that lecture. And yes, I now have watched that lecture again, because people accuse me online of, oh, you didn't understand the context I was told. You're just defending whites as usual, as I was told. All of the things that detract from what Leshaba actually said, and the appalling nature of them, his defenders, that is, online. So having watched it again, I know what's going to happen. He'll likely walk back that comment that, Hitler committed no crime. Verbatim is what he said in that sense. And argue that he was making the broader racial argument, which for me is still trash. You cannot argue that, the murder of one group of people only happened to matter, or rather open the gateway to recognizing the horrendous nature of the murder of another set of people only because whites were now being murdered. That is a problematic statement, and I hate using the word problematic given how overused by the left that expression in itself is, but it's deeply appalling that someone even views the world in that nature, and that's why I labeled him a race merchant, a purveyor of this idea that morality is selective based on aesthetic things, whether it's gender, race, or the like. So we're going to keep an eye on that. It's likely going to play out in the next week or so. So we're going to keep an eye on that on the show. If you're watching, welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. We're at the quarter mark of the show. My guests, Terence, Corrigan, and Anthea Jeffery from the Institute of Race Relations. I will be putting your comments on screen, so please get involved in the conversation. Guys, let me move us on to something else which caught my eye this week in the headlines. Of course, probably irked every other South African too. Eskom, that large, cumbersome zombie, hiked its prices of its only product that it produces, electricity, by 15%. Yet we still come from a little period a few weeks ago of load shedding. Terence, what's going on here? How are we paying more for something we don't get?
No, look, I think if I can default to the sort of broader point, as we've said earlier, I think this is very meaniful because it shows just how far to the end of the road we've come. If electricity prices are going up, everything follows, and that is going to hit people at the bottom of the pile just that much harder than it's going to hit the more affluent.
Yeah.
Remember, this isn't just about your household bills. Although if you're paying, if you sort of on a very modest income, your electricity bills, let's say 500 rand a month. That's another 75 rand. That's another sort of 3-4 loaves of bread. Look at it in those terms. But grocery bills, everything else will start to go up. And this is when we have had an effective real-term cut in social grants, which despite the concerns about their sustainability, were one of the more effective means of combating this, the direst forms of poverty in the country. But basically, the piggy bank is empty. I remember about 10 years ago when we were going through the financial crisis, NERSA wagged its finger at Eskom and said, no, you can't have this this increase you're looking for. It's going to hurt people too badly. The fact that they are doing so now speaks volumes about the reality of the situation, not the sort of spin or grifted reality. It's deeply concerning. I think that many people watching here who are in what is South Africa relatively comfortable circumstances, are going to feel this as a pinch. Go somewhat down the socioeconomic ladder. That becomes a very vicious bite.
Sorry, you lost me there for a moment. But you're absolutely right. And Anthea, I must bring it to you because we've been having this conversation for quite a while now. And I want to make it just a point, and I want to see how you handle and deal with it. But, one would think that, if you have a sole producer of electricity or gas or water, or that prices would be cheap, we're told, right, by the statist lot. But clearly that's not the case. We're finding ourselves now in a situation where we're actually really asking poorer people. I mean, well-off people and rich people can absorb the cost. I mean, we'll moan about it and we'll really groan, but really it's poor people who are having to cough up more here, isn't it?
Absolutely, and also completely unnecessary in the sense that there was a time back in 2001, as I recall, when Eskom was highly successful at producing electricity on scale and cheaply. And that has really changed, of course, since the effective government policy increasingly took effect, and we had people, really the wrong people, appointed to senior jobs without necessary engineering and other skills. We had extraordinary procurement scandals, not just relating to the Guptas, but over a long period of time. We have this big build program where the costs have absolutely escalated, and where the two power stations, Medupi and Kusile, are probably white elephants because they seem not to be capable of producing the power they ought to. And every attempt to try and get them right seems to fail, but just to cost more money. And there seems to be really an unwillingness to contemplate what are the real underlying problems for Eskom's poor performance. And the only way to get it right is to change the policies that have made it wrong in the first place. So you're going to have a willingness to appoint people for their skills rather than on the basis of employment equity. You're going to have to turn procurement into something that, as the Constitution requires, is actually done on the basis of price and cost effectiveness and efficiency. Very much you need probably to retrench a number of people, even that's a very hard thing to do at this era. Or we must have so much growth in the economy that we can absorb this kind of waste without hurting people too much. And we're not making any attempt to get that growth in the economy. And specifically on Eskom, we've also had now, I think, a really extraordinarily foolish decision that in terms of emergency procurement, instead of allowing the mines and others to do the self-generation that they've been begging to be allowed to do, we have now 4 power ships about to arrive for a period of 20 years. It's all very well if you have an emergency procurement that goes on for 3 years, but for 20 years, we're going to be committed to paying for these power ships at a very high rate, which means that the costs will go up yet again. And it's just a band-aid. It's a refusal once again to recognize what are the real problems with Eskom. And one fears that there probably are some sort of BEE procurement elements behind this decision, which again just mean that certain people are milking the situation for their own benefit and at the great cost of all South Africans.
Absolutely. And one gets the sense here, because it's going to lead into our conversation, I suppose, on the threats to property rights. But one gets the sense, as I was beginning to say, that it's the bad ideas. It is the bad government ideas that are beginning to now take an immense toll on the average South African. Terence, I want to come back to you because there's one just quick point that there's something it said to me a while back and I'm just remembering. I want you to say, to bring out on the show here. But, you would think, therefore, especially given what Anthea said, that, politicians, the political elites would look at this and say, you know what, guys, maybe it's time we stop eating at the trough as the elites. These wonderful mega tenders that come our way through these state-owned enterprises, because the people who the politicians claim they affect to trade for, i.e. the poor, are the ones who are now literally suffering whilst we, the political elites, are getting wealthy. Maybe it's time for just a moment, we throw these services to the market and allow even poor people, if they band together, start a business that can compete, to actually create these services that can then be bought by the state and by citizens directly. But it seems that on an ideological level, we're moving in the other direction, aren't we, Terence? Unfortunately, more state control, more politicians in control.
Yeah, no, look, I think this is what certainly a lot of people in business particularly don't seem to understand, that this is that there is this baleful, dead, skeletal hand of ideology that sits over so many of these decisions, and not more than any sort of individual decision, over the entire framework of policy of politics. And there is great affection in the ANC, for instance, in this notion of a developmental state. Hence the idea of throwing things to the market, is untenable. It points to South Korea, to Taiwan, to China and says, well, this is what state-led development does. But then it refuses to actually learn the lessons that while industrial policy played a very, very big part in their development, it was also done significantly off the back of private business, private entrepreneurship, often being cajoled and bullied, and sometimes with collusive relationships between elites and a lot of corruption. But it pushed in the right direction. You had a state that although serving authoritarian ends, was properly and technically capacitated. The whole point of a developmental state, if you read the research on it, is that it employs its best and its brightest, and often these people aren't politically connected. They're often technocrats who will then be able to sort of tell the politicians, this is what you need to do. The politicians then use political power, and business people produce. But when I hear many figures in the ruling party and the ideological allies talk about China, it often seems to be stuck in the 1960s. It's Mao, and it's great leap forwards and cultural revolutions and thousand flowers blooming, etc., etc., etc. We talked about genocide. Now, I'm not sure that you can really apply the word genocide, but 60 million people died in those famines. They tried to kill every sparrow in China, and then you had insects that came and that came and ate everything. It was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
But it took getting rid of Mao to actually get China moving. Yet I don't know. That detail seems to have escaped some of the powers that be. It's truly extraordinary.
Absolutely, truly extraordinary. Speaking about extraordinary, another thing which was absolutely fascinating, and it boggled my mind as to it having taken so long. John Hlophe, the Cape Judge President, finally being found. I shouldn't say finally, but effectively a verdict finally being reached, and guilty being one of gross misconduct. He was found by his peers. The allegations, of course, having been that he unduly tried to influence two constitutional court judges. Anthea, I'm going to begin with you here. Your thoughts, just initial reaction to this.
As you say, it is extraordinary that it's taken so long. This saga began in 2008, when Judge Hlophe was alleged to have tried to influence the two constitutional court judges in a matter involving Jacob Zuma, where he was trying to prevent the prosecution authorities from being able to use 93,000 documents, which were rather telling of his potential involvement in corruption and so on. And it was obviously crucial to him that the Constitutional Court should rule those documents out. And it is extraordinary that Judge Hlophe seems indeed to have spoken to these two judges, as the Judicial Service Tribunal has now confirmed, with a view to changing the verdict that the Constitutional Court would otherwise have reached. And as that tribunal said, this is the most extraordinary conduct on behalf of one of the most senior judges in the country. And unfortunately, the saga is also not yet over. This was a decision of the tribunal established by the Commission. It still has to be endorsed by the Commission itself. Hopefully there will be no difficulty with that, because it was a unanimous decision of the tribunal. But we know from the whole Stalingrad strategy that Jacob Zuma has used so well over many years, that Judge Hlophe may decide to take everything on appeal, and there may be further delays before there is any final verdict. But I think we can be glad that the verdict that we have thus far, after this extraordinary delay, is one that holds Judge Hlophe accountable, because it's more than past time that we had such a finding in relation to conduct of that kind.
Absolutely. Terence, your thoughts?
Well, I defer to Anthea and her legal knowledge here. I don't really have much to add, except to say that as a layperson, I can't really imagine if I was accused of something like, or something far less serious, pilfering stationery or whatever. Assuming we still had we weren't in virtual offices now, so it's difficult. You don't last 12. You don't sit around for 12 years. This is one of the most senior officials and one of the most important officers of the country. It's
absolutely.
I keep on coming back to my pet word. It's extraordinary.
It really is. And it I think it angered a lot of people too. And speaking about anger, let me just keep an eye on time because my viewers do get a bit angry when I waffle away here. You're at the 30-minute mark. If you're just joining us, welcome to it. We're beginning to cook with grease now, as I often say, as I have my two guests. That's Dr. Anthea Jeffery from the Institute of Race Relations, and of course, Terence Corrigan, also from the IRR, and someone who you'll find writes a lot on the Daily Friend. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. You've just joined us at what will be the meat and potatoes of this conversation as we look at the threats to you, the ordinary South Africans, to your property rights, your ability as a South African, an individual. And really, I talk a lot about an individual, but we're a family society. So the individual, the ability of families in this country to say, I own this. This is ours. That ability is under threat in South Africa by a gaggle of politicians, leftist ones at that, who are looking to give themselves power to take from you without having to compensate you. There's a lot of moving parts to this conversation. So I'm going to defer to Anthea in this regard to give us an update. Where are we right now? What are the two pieces of legislation that are currently before our institution? That's Parliament and the states. What's happening at the moment, Anthea? And we'll pick up the conversation from there.
Thanks, Sihle. Well, we have two bills that are proceeding through the legislative process. The one is the draft constitutional amendment bill, which is intended to change Section 25 of the Constitution so as to make it possible to have expropriation without compensation. They're not so much using the EWC term anymore, but rather talking about having no compensation on expropriation in circumstances which are entirely unclear. According to the bill, Parliament will decide from time to time what circumstances should merit the payment of no compensation, and in each instance it will be for the courts to decide that no compensation in fact applies. That's the constitutional amendment bill, and it is being prepared by an ad hoc committee which was in fact appointed at the beginning, the end of 2018, then had its work very much interrupted by the COVID issue and lockdown last year, and is now really rushing to conclude the process. It's received something like 204,000 written submissions since it really only began working again towards the end of last year. It seems very unlikely that committee members have actually read those submissions. They seem to be trying to delegate the task to parliamentary staff when it's the obligation of MPs to get to grips with those submissions and their content for themselves. Secondly, they've made quite an arbitrary choice of what individuals and organizations should be invited to come and make oral submissions to the ad hoc committee. The principle is supposed to be, if you ask to make an oral presentation in your written submission, you should be given the chance to do that. But because they don't really ever get to grips with the written submissions, they don't know who asked to make oral presentations. And it's a kind of lucky dip as to whether you get the chance or not. And the IRR, unfortunately, was one of those unfairly left on. Then secondly, we have the expropriation bill. And this is one of the laws to be adopted by Parliament that will decide when no compensation should be payable. And the expropriation bill sets out 5 instances where this would apply. One is where the owner is deemed to have abandoned his land because he's lost control over it. And in the context of a great number of land invasions, that's a worrying thing, because people who are subject to a land invasion may then also find that their property is expropriated for no compensation. It might actually be an incentive for land invasions. And this can certainly affect both black and white South Africans. There was a horrific story a number of years ago where the Imanyandus, who owned land in KwaZulu-Natal, were actually forcibly evicted from their land at the instance of a local traditional leader, and then barred from ever coming back. And though they had a title deed, they had lost control of the land through no fault of their own. But they could, according to the bill, now be penalized by having that land expropriated from them for no compensation. So that's one of the sorts of problems in that bill. But more beyond that, it's also very vague as to the limits of when nil compensation may apply. It says that it's listing 5 instances, but it's not a closed list. So other situations might also arise where a municipality or a national or provincial department or Eskom might decide that nil compensation would be appropriate. And what is very worrying under the expropriation bill is that the expropriation procedures are very much skewed in favor of the state and against the owner. So for many owners, they will have a right in theory to go to the courts to contest the amount or the validity of the expropriation. In practice, the whole expropriation process may go so quickly that they will have lost their key assets before they can get to court and without having received compensation. And they will also, it seems, bear the onus of proving that what the state has done is wrong. And that could be a very difficult onus to discharge. And if they don't convince the court of that, then they must pay not only their own costs, but the costs pretty much of the state as well. So for most people, if you've already just lost your home, your business premises, your farm, whatever, it's really not very feasible that you can go to court and try and contest that the expropriation is sufficient. And on the procedures, they received 90,000 written submissions by the end of February. And by the 3rd week of March, they were busy arranging oral submissions. Again, it's quite clear that they hadn't got to grips with those 90,000 written submissions. Again, a rather arbitrary choice of who should be asked to make an oral submission. So fundamentally flawed processes, apart from fundamentally flawed content. And what we really need, particularly at this juncture with our economy, is to go back to the starting point, to say we want a great reset on these 2 bills, because both of them were initiated long before we had the COVID disaster. Our economy was limping along before. Now we're at a situation where GDP contracted by 7% last year. There's something like 1.4 million jobs have been lost, where tax revenues are so down and public debt is so up that we are still at risk of a sovereign debt default. And over again, we see that the government is running out of money. So what we need is a proper socioeconomic impact assessment. All bills are supposed to be preceded by such a process. The final report of the CS assessment is supposed to be attached to a bill when it is released for public comment. That hasn't happened with either the constitutional amendment bill or the expropriation bill. And that, again, is an abuse of the public participation process. Because if people are ready to have a chance to know about the issues and then to have a say, they should have a proper CS, which does a proper assessment of all the economic pros and cons, what possible benefits might be against the huge costs that are likely to be, so that people can then be informed when they make their submissions. And so their submissions can be taken seriously by Parliament and by the ANC.
Before I come to you, Terence, I just want to make this quick point, just for the sake of the viewers. Again, as Anthea rightly pointed out, there's 2 key movements here, so to speak, 2 pieces of legislation, one being amended, one being proposed. The one is the amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution. There's a whole process for that, the same one which Anthea rightly is pointing out is being rushed by politicians, and we haven't seen much in the way of a consideration of the more than 200,000, you said, Anthea, submissions, the written submissions to that. I know there's currently well, actually, before I even say that, I'll let Terence get into that. The other one, of course, is the expropriation bill. This is the actual proposed piece of legislation that will see politicians give themselves the power through various state institutions to be able to confiscate something from you, property effectively from you, and potentially pay nothing for it. They're trying to introduce that into this piece of legislation. So I just had to quickly just revisit that, just for those who maybe are joining the conversation. Terence, let me come to you, because Anthea makes an important point. And it's a division that's become crystal clear in this entire process. There is what the political elites want, and there is what ordinary South Africans say on this matter. The elites want the power. The ordinary people want the ability to own land. Why is there a disconnect here? What's going on?
Was there a disconnect? Well, once again, the ideology that that one finds among many of our elites is not actually widely shared.
Yeah.
there's a massive polling on this, and by ourselves. But if you, as certain of our friends in the media have said, don't trust what we produce. Well, fine, go and look at Afrobarometer. What emerges is that most South Africans are actually fairly centrist to conservative in their political outlook. The idea of owning a home is very, very deeply rooted across cultures. In fact, I remember speaking to a gentleman. This was in 1997, and he was part of that generation of 76, and he had some quite awful memories of what went down there. But I remember speaking to him and asking him about the political culture that he was raised in, and he said, the thing about African culture, it was never compatible with communism. Why? He said, because before white people ever set foot in this continent, we owned cattle. He said, it may not have been, huge and complicated, but there was this idea that these were our things. George Aiti has written extensively about this across the continent. That's right. The idea, if you applied your labor and your efforts to a particular resource, that was then recognized as yours. Now, this is not perhaps directly the type of sort of Western understanding of property rights, but it is definitely a form of property ownership. If you go back through the 1900s, the deprivation of property was not just a case of destroying people's livelihoods. But there were some areas of the country where Black people had freehold ownership. Alexandra, for instance, the Edendale Valley outside Pietermaritzburg. Those became very, very sort of hot button areas, and the resistance there was particularly fierce because these were communities which against the odds actually owned these things in terms of colonial or apartheid law, and now. The government is coming to them and saying, no, we've changed our mind. There's a wealth of survey information about people wanting to own their RDP houses. For a long time, your political elite, and perhaps we should have some understanding here, often saw itself as being, I think, responsible for their well-being rather than to them as citizens. So yes, you sort of hand over a house and now you have shelter, and that's great. But this person doesn't have a job, so he wants to rent it out, and then he has someone in a position of political power telling him no, you can't do that. You must live in the house. Well, I can sort of understand the reasoning, but then again, I also think that one has to treat that person as a grown-up. And if generating 1,000 rand a month from the rental income compensates for not having a job, and he or she is then willing to live in a shack, that is that person's decision. The problem here, and I think you also have to look at how people acquire property. Linked to the direct deprivation of Black people's property rights, was there inability to acquire property because of things like job reservation and being confined to homelands. Now, if our economy had grown at sort of 5% per annum since the 1990s, or even since the sort of mid 2000s when it started to pick up, if we just maintained that, we would have millions and millions of more people in jobs. Even if the jobs were not particularly lucrative, and there's also survey evidence on that, not from the IRR, also from Afrobarometer, that say that people would much rather have a low-paying job than have to subsist on a state grant. getting into a sort of McDonald's position, which is not actually a dreadful place to work. It's air conditioned and whatever. Gives you some ability. And we have cut 10 million people out of our economy by denying those opportunities.
And I want to get into this because, Anthea, I'm going to come back to you because often, as always happens in these cases, race comes into the equation. Race, of course, being the rather favorite refuge of the political elites. We're told, Anthea, oh no, they'll say, but black folk love expropriation without compensation. They love the idea of, as the political elites are telling us, you'll own nothing and be happy. They'll say, oh, black folk love that stuff. They love government being in control of things on our behalf. So you've got support from black folk, as we're told by the political elites. But Anthea, I need you to talk to me about this. Surely there's a disconnect here. And let me add one more thing, actually, just to make it even more spicier. They'll tell us, whilst they say all these things about black people, oh no, they'll say, black people need not worry about expropriation without compensation. We, the political elites, are not going to take land from you. Oh no, they'll say. We'll take it from those evil whites, those white land thieves. The white settlers, is the expression they use. But we clearly know this is wrong, Anthea. There's cases right now of black people who are tasting the cold steel of EWC in a sense, currently, isn't there?
Absolutely, yes. So perhaps let me start there and then come to the opinion polling and so on. Yes, I think one of the most notable and one of the saddest cases involves somebody by the name of Becky Blamini, who had inherited 3,000 hectares in the Grantville area. And this land had come to him through his family, and he had never been able to obtain title to it until finally the Land Acts went. And so it became possible for black people to have formal title to land which had been informally owned in the past. And he had title. And then he discovered in about 2014 rumors that the municipality, I think it's the KwaZulu municipality, had expropriated his land. So he went to Pietermaritzburg and he discovered that his land was registered in the name of the municipality and that this had happened months ago. And he had never received a notice of expropriation. And he then went to lawyers, and it took months, if not more than a year, for a notice of expropriation finally to reach him. And of course, the courts couldn't act in any way to try and intervene unless it was clear what had happened. And without a notice of expropriation, you couldn't get to first base with the court system. And ultimately, once he had the notice of expropriation, and after municipality further muddied the waters that they had, but in various ways, I won't get into that, he went to court. And the court, unfortunately, took the view that there had been too much delay. Now, that delay was not his fault, but they said they couldn't intervene so late in the day. So he lost his land. He got no compensation whatsoever. If the notice of expropriation had received him, he could at least have fought in some way if he could have found help to do so. But, and he's not the only one in the area. There was another case too that came before the courts, a very similar case, where a man didn't know that his land had been already registered in the name of the municipality because he didn't get the notice of expropriation. And the scary thing under the expropriation bill is that they can serve a notice of expropriation by sending it to you by registered post. And I don't know how efficient they think the post office is, but one has really worries about how that will work in practice. Because if you don't know about it, you can't begin to fight it. And you could wake up to find that your land is simply registered in the name of the municipality, a housing department, whatever. And I think that in understanding the importance of land to the black community, it's also important, of course, to recognize everything that happened in apartheid, as Terence was saying. And to recognize, too, that there's been an extraordinary change since the National Party government eventually began lightening up and allowing black people to buy their houses in the urban areas and elsewhere. So that now we're in a situation where something like 7.8 million African people do own homes, small brick and mortar structures. Very many of them don't have title deeds, which is what they critically, most importantly, need. But now they are vulnerable to the loss of their informal rights to those houses, because the expropriation bill will make it so very easy for the government and for inept, often corrupt, inefficient, cash-strapped organs of state to expropriate property, houses, farms, business premises, and other property as well.
Absolutely. Guys, we're in the final 10 minutes of the show. So with that being said, welcome to it. If you're watching us, please pop your questions in the comment section. I'll put them up on screen, because maybe one of the questions I want to have or put forward to you guys now is, given that we currently have these two processes, therefore, before Parliament, before Parliament in real terms, that is the amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution and the Expropriation Bill. The Expropriation Bill having currently what I'd like to call a dog and pony show of oral submissions, where often politicians cajole their members into these packed halls to wax lyrical and venerate, how grand and awesome our political elites are for this wonderful policy of theft, or excuse me, of expropriation. But we have this sham facade, Anthea, if we will, of public participation, and a lot of people might be wondering, watching this and watching, what do we do about this? What is the IRR doing, perhaps, and what can we do as individuals to push back against this and begin to wage that fight, if you will, against the political elites who are pushing this policy on us?
I think it is fortunately possible to challenge both bills. First of all, for the flawed, defective procedures that have been used. And that's the kind of legal argument that our courts are more likely to find easier to endorse. If you challenge the substance of the bills, which might be possible to more easy on the expropriation bill, you might run up against the reluctance of the courts to contradict the government on a law that it badly wants. But point out that the procedures have been wrong. And I think it is easier for the courts to recognize that wrong procedures can't be allowed to stand. And so we have actually had a number of bills, including the reopening of the land restitution process bill, that was struck down by the Constitutional Court because the procedures had been inadequate. The whole thing had been rushed and flawed. And again, we have something that is rushed and flawed. And I think it does mean that litigation is possible once these bills have gone through, to contest the process and to say that it needs to be done again from the start, beginning, as I said, with that proper socioeconomic impact assessment and a final CS report attached to whatever version of the bills comes back for public comment in the future through a proper process.
Sorry, I was saying, let me come to you, Terence, because there's of course the litigation route, and it's a critically important avenue that people need to start banding together around and supporting organizations that are especially in defense of our rights. But there's also the other side of it, which is the battle of ideas. The notion really that you've got to win this battle. Also in the minds, if you will, the hearts and minds of South Africans, having them be the loudest voices in opposition to what the elite is trying to ram down our throats. A good example right now, I'm in KZN. I'll be here for the next 2 weeks. I've been in conversation with some traditional leadership out here, especially in my part of the world where I have communal land that I own. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but I do have land that's been in my family for near on 5 generations now, which I'm trying to defend and create a farm on. The point being, I was in a conversation with my local traditional leader about I was testing the waters on these notions. And one of the biggest things I'm hearing now is, and he's echoing something the King, the late King used to say, which is, listen, we're not opposed to reform, especially if it's reform that is geared towards giving the people who live here more ownership, more say. What they were opposed to is the idea of Pretoria taking over, which was the fear that the late King also had. And that's what forced them to sort of clam up. But that spoke to me about this notion that maybe we can win some of, the louder vested interest groups. We can sort of put them on our camp, so to speak, of being on the side of defending property rights and really advancing property rights. What are your thoughts on this, the battle of ideas, the kind of work we need to do?
Well, look, I don't think that there's a louder, more audible, sometimes ruder voice in the country on this issue than myself. Look, I make the argument again and again and again. But I think people need to understand that it's an argument that needs to go outside of your echo chamber. For me, I think that a constituency that I've tried to reach in my writing and also directly is business. Now, business is inherently conservative. Understand that, small c. It doesn't like confrontation. It wants to focus on making money and doing its thing. So its default setting is better not to get involved. But I do find a very interesting thing about South African business. Corporate governance thinking in South Africa has actually been very influential all over the world, the so-called King reports. And one thing that they've emphasized again and again is that business cannot stand aside from the societies in which it operates. In fact, I remember speaking to one executive with a business association, and he said that was the big lesson that business learned over the Zuma years, is that ultimately it starts to hurt you, and ultimately you have to start taking some sort of stand. Now, given developments in the sector that this guy operated in, I'm not quite sure. I think he may be too optimistic there, but that's something that I think the titans of industry in South Africa have to think about. This is in their interest, but it is also the interest of the country at large, and the future of South Africa as a business-friendly destination, as a place where businesses can both make money for themselves and be accepted as good citizens of the society, is now on the line, and they need to step up. I think, I think the worst possible thing any business person or any business sector could try and do is try and cut a little deal for themselves on this.
Absolutely.
We'll sort of throw the smaller operators under the bus, but just leave the big guys alone, or something. Some variant of that, because you feed that crocodile, and that crocodile is going to come and eat you. And it's important to understand that in as far as there are some good chaps in the ANC or whatever, you have this baleful influence of ideology, which I think has exercised a definitive influence. And until that is combated and forced back, we are going to be stuck in this situation, and this could well be in another lost decade.
Absolutely. Guys, we've run out of time. I'm really, really, really sorry. Maybe just a final word, 40 seconds each. Either how can people find your work? What are some of the things you'll be writing about this week, or what to look out for in the coming weeks, especially when it comes to this issue of EWC, the bill, and of course the amendment? Anthea, I'll begin with you.
Well, I think, both Terence and I have been writing about both bills for a long time, and there's a great deal of information on them, which is really written for a lay audience, put it that way, and particularly in the Daily Friend. We really try to set out the issues clearly and simply so that people can understand what's at stake. So there's a lot of material on the Daily Friend that will make it easier to see what's going on. I think what we've been talking about too, but not having enough time to address, is that there are really serious and sensible ways of sorting out the questions of land reform, particularly with a focus on how can we expand the number of commercial farmers, black and white, and particularly with an emphasis on providing opportunities for new entrants. And there are any numbers of sensible things that you need to do for that, beginning with granting farmers and securing to farmers their property rights. So that's the sine qua non. And Terence is talking about business. Again, Agri-SA and many other of the organized agricultural organizations have done their best to put forward constructive suggestions, as has the IRR and various other organizations. The point is to try and make the politicians recognize the truth of it And just to quickly throw in our latest poll, when we asked people if they wanted a political party that supported growth and jobs or one that went for massive land expropriation, it was 15% of Black respondents who supported the massive land expropriation and more than 80% that said they wanted growth and jobs.
Absolutely.
And that's the message that our politicians need to heed.
Absolutely. Does that not just tell the tale right there? Thank you, Anthea. And again, I'm really sorry for running out of time on this one, but Terence, final word. What are you going to be writing about this week, and what should we be keeping an eye on?
One interesting thing that the government is trying to use to spin this is the question of policy certainty. So, well, even if you don't like what we're doing, we're going to have fixed rules, and then we can all move on and we can, arrange our business around it. That's complete and utter twat.
Absolutely.
This increases uncertainty, and I think people need to keep an eye on a few things. The expropriation bill is supposedly constitutionally compliant with the Constitution as it exists, which is slated for amendment. So even that logic doesn't exist. There's talk about a specialized land court, to sort of try and default to, well, it's not great, it may be bad, but at least we'll know what we're dealing with. No, this issue is going to bumble on its current trajectory for years and years and years. And I think South Africans who care about home ownership, who care about prospects in the job market, who care about South Africa's future, as a reasonably successful developing country, need to draw the line in the sand here.
Absolutely, fully agreed. Thank you to both Terence Corrigan and Anthea Jeffery from the Institute of Race Relations, rightly mentioning that you can find all the news, analysis, and opinion, and especially their news and views, on the Daily Friend website. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Thank you to both my guests, and of course, thank you, dear viewer, for watching. It's been a very interesting show, as usual. Excellent guests, and I think they laid out quite lucidly what's happening at the moment and how you need to keep up with developments around the attempt by politicians to push ideas and push policies that could potentially strip you of your ability to own something, anything, whether it's land, the money in your wallet, the money in your pension, or even just something you own. A reminder that, expropriation without compensation isn't just about land. Neither is it just about, quote, white land. It threatens all of us, and it threatens all of our possessions. So get in the fight, get involved, go to www.dailyfriend.co.za, see what's happening and how you can begin to push back, and support those of us who are on the ground influencing ordinary people with the ideas that combat this. I'm currently in KZN, and I really meant what I said earlier on. One of the things I'm looking to do is to talk to some of the traditional leaders in my part of the world, and hopefully across the country, to sway them to become some of the strongest agents for defending property rights and advancing them onto the people who live on their emakaya. Sorry, I can't think of the word emakaya in English. on rural land in this country. So please support the work that we're doing. We're on the ground. I'm not just a talk show host. I literally live in this vehicle, traveling the length and breadth of this country, talking to ordinary South Africans, influencing them with the sort of ideas that can advance and protect our rights, our life, liberty, and property rights. So with that being said, I super appreciate for watching. Hit that like button. Please share the link to the show after the show, and I'll see you on Wednesday for the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I hope you enjoyed this, and a reminder to you as I end the show and every show, never trust a commie.